Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Charles Overby, chairman of the Overby Center for Southern Journalism and Politics. I'm delighted to welcome you here to our continuing series of programs this fall featuring writers, politicians, sports experts, and extraordinaire Curtis Wilkie. Curtis is, he owns this place. He's the inaugural fellow of the Overby Center, and he's been here since day one. And he distinguishes this place because of his intelligence and his vision, and he normally is the one that puts these programs together. And we were sitting down talking about the fall program, and I said, Curtis, you've left off an obvious program. He said, what's that? I said, yourself. You've just written a great book, and we don't have a program here. So he kind of put his head down, and we agreed to do this program today. You know, we could just have a phone book here rather than this terrific book and talk to Curtis, and it would be interesting. Most of you know Curtis. Curtis grew up in Mississippi, and he traveled all around Mississippi. He graduated. I didn't really know this till today. I've always associated him with down in South Mississippi. He graduated from Corinth High School, and he is being honored at the end of the week as Alumnus of the Year. Now, Curtis, that's a high honor. We're going to talk about your book, but I want to talk about you too. How does a person get to be Alumnus of the Year at Corinth High School?
They're hard up for candidates, obviously.
You had a storied history there at Corinth. Is this
Not a good one. That's why all the school administrators are twitching in their graves now upon learning of this decision.
You know, Curtis is the great example of the circle of life. You know, I really believe in the circle of life. Things happen sometimes, and then it kind of comes back around. He likes to tell people about being the only professor on the Ole Miss campus who teaches now a course that he failed when he was a student. And that would be feature writing. And he's a terrific teacher, feature writing, and the only reason he failed it wasn't because he couldn't write, but because he didn't turn his story in on time. And so it does show that there is a circle of life. And perhaps, Curtis, you weren't the most accomplished student at Corinth High School, but
Or Ole Miss.
Or well, watch out, you'll be meddling here with both of us. Curtis, how many books is this now?
4.
4 books that you've written. Curtis is on quite a tour this week. He goes tomorrow down to Jackson to speak, and then you go up to the Delta. Where are you speaking?
Greenwood.
Greenwood. And then he goes to Nashville, where C-SPAN is interviewing him at the book festival in Nashville. And then he goes to Corinth to be honored. And then he comes back here for the Ole Miss-Alabama football game. So he's keeping quite a schedule for someone who's not retired, but has a long career with the Boston Globe as one of their very best writers. And Curtis, talking about your best writing, would it be accurate to say this book represents the best of Curtis Wilkie?
I'm not sure what is the best or worst of Curtis Wilkie. Some of my favorite stories are not in there because I tried to give the University Press stories that largely dealt with the South or were set in Mississippi for obvious reasons. I think if I have an audience for this book, it would be fellow Mississippians. And yeah, I was honored when they asked me to do it, so I just assembled a bunch of oldies but goodies, and maybe pride is one of the 7 deadly sins, but I'm proud of the stories that are in there. But there are a lot of others that aren't in there that I enjoyed. A lot of them from the Middle East and a lot of them from all the various presidential campaigns I covered.
Now, this is a sign of Curtis's humility. If I wrote a book that had 50 of my stories in it, it would be the best of Charles Overby. But Curtis has said in a very humble way that this merely represents some of the best of Curtis Wilkie. It was an example of how many good stories that he's written. Curtis, this is an unusual title, Assassins, Eccentrics, Politicians, and Other Persons of Interest. How did this title come to be, and how accurate is that in summarizing this book?
Well, you know, you were a party to this. You remember after a program, you and I and Tom Oliphant and Nancy went out to dinner, and
you didn't take my advice.
well, I think we all liked the title. The University Press had already said they didn't like my original title, which was Rogue's Garden. They thought
So I want to tell you what my title was for him. Lunatics I Have Known.
that was a good one, but they wouldn't buy that either. And
And the problem with that was not everybody in here is a lunatic. So it does cover a broad level of interest and subjects.
Trent Lott's not a lunatic.
No, I said not everybody was a lunatic. So, but it will be interesting for the people who are in this book to decide which category they fit in. But other persons of interest is
Other
acceptable.
persons. Yes, somebody called me up and says, well, who's the assassin other than Beckwith? And I started thinking, I think I come up with about 7 or 8 people who were either assassins or were assassinated, who are featured in my stories.
And you have a few political assassins in here too.
Yep, character assassins.
Yeah, right, character assassin. Curtis and I have had the privilege to co-teach together for the last 3 years, and so I've gotten to know a little bit about Curtis, and I've seen some of his stories before they were in here. One of the amazing things to me about Curtis was how early in his career he wrote about interesting people, and what a presence of mind that he had about that. Accordingly, and in this book, Curtis, early in your career, you covered 2 people of historic proportions, and the stories stand up well today, Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King. Tell us how, at such an early age, you came to be writing about both those men and insights that you carry with you even today.
I was just very fortunate that I began my career after I graduated from Ole Miss in '63. Not on time, I should add. I was originally class of '62, but I got out late and went to work in Clarksdale. And at that time, the civil rights movement was just really beginning to boil into the biggest story in the country. And there, even though I'm working for a small daily newspaper in the Mississippi Delta, I find myself covering the biggest story in the country. Almost every day there are demonstrations, there are rallies, and all the various important figures in the movement are coming through Clarksdale or coming through the Delta. So it was just an extraordinary bit of good fortune on my part, and having covered the movement for virtually the whole time I was in Clarksdale and meeting people like Dr. King and covering Bobby Kennedy on 2 visits to Mississippi, one here at Ole Miss where he got a very warm reception in '66, and then he came to the Delta for a tour in '67, and the only conversation I had with him, he came over to a group of 3 or 4 of us reporters to talk, and I just asked him, well, Senator, how did you enjoy your trip to Ole Miss last year? And his eyes kind of twinkled, and he said, were you there? I says, yeah, I covered it. He said, it was the most extraordinary welcome I've ever gotten. Said, I was expecting something much worse, and it was just incredibly warm, and his wife had been with him. So, you know, he remembered very fondly the trip to Ole Miss. Dr. King came through Clarksdale several times. Back then, you know, the movement was divided among the different organizations, and it was a real turf battle. and Mississippi was basically NAACP territory. And so Dr. King didn't spend as much time here as he did, say, in Georgia and Alabama, which are SCLC territories. You had the young people who were allied with SNCC, and then people who were with CORE, Congress for Racial Equality. Those were the four big organizations. But and they eventually, those turf battles basically split the movement and effectively destroyed the movement. But Aaron Henry, who was the state president of NAACP, lived in Clarksdale. He was a pharmacist, and he became a great friend and a great source for me. He let me know whenever things were going on, who's coming to town. He made sure that I would interview Jackie Robinson, for example, which was a real kick. And Dr. King, I've got 4 stories in the book that are based on his last pilgrimage to the Delta when he was trying to organize support for his Poor People's Campaign in the spring of '68. And I traveled behind him. He had a car. That was how unprepossessing the thing was. And no other reporter was with him. And I followed in my little Volkswagen Beetle, and he had a car with Jose Williams and Ralph Abernathy and a young woman. And wherever they went, I'd follow them and cover the events. He had a meeting in Marks at Black Church, a rally in the middle of the day, and just as it was starting, this white guy banged into the church, and he began reaching in his back pocket. And Jack Thornell was there, a very good photographer for AP, who had won the Pulitzer Prize the year before for the picture of Meredith getting shot up in DeSoto County. Meredith is spread eagled on the highway, and the guy has a shotgun in the background. So Jack, a legitimate photographer, is there, and I'm there with the camera and my notepad, and I'm in this split second, I'm thinking, do I try to stop this guy who may be about to shoot Dr. King, or should I wait and get the Pulitzer Prize winning photo? Well, thank God, the guy, instead of a gun, he pulled out a $100 bill, and he went up and presented it to Dr. King. Dr. King's big-eyed and amazed, and I took a picture of it, and that picture's in my book, Dixie, which is still on sale, incidentally, down at Square Books, even though it came out a few years ago. And he says, well, God bless you, Brother Mobley was his name, Money Mobley. And Money had had a few drinks beforehand, and he said, anybody who gives some money for the movement can say a few words. Anyway, that was a big mistake. Because Money immediately says, I want to tell you about the goddamn Kennedys. He says, there ain't no hungry people down here. And so the whole congregation is in uproar, and Jose Williams and Abernathy grab him and kind of frog march him out of the church. And after it was over, I'm talking to Dr. King, and he's in the car, and I remember he was eating chicken, and I'm standing outside, and I'm interviewing him, talking to him. I said, well, Dr. King, were you frightened by that incident? And he said, no. He said, I wasn't. He said, basically, it's a paraphrase. It's in the book. He said, I move around now without fear. If I were fearful, it would immobilize me, and I'd be no good to the movement. Besides, the climate of violence in the South is diminishing. And 2 weeks later, he was dead.
You know, Curtis, you were covering history at the time. Did you know it?
I think I did with that. I mean, the story was so enormous and so big, and it's still the single biggest story I ever covered, over a period of years. I think it's the biggest story of my lifetime in America, what went on. And it became a frame of reference for me for the rest of my career and probably for the rest of my life. I think most journalists tend to like underdogs anyway. And this was a clear story, at least to me. This was a story that was clearly black and white, where the blacks were the good guys and the white guys were the bad guys, at least the powerful whites. Most stories are shaded, very nuanced, but this one was so clear. And you know, Hank Klibanoff, who was so generous to write an introduction, he and Gene Roberts wrote a wonderful book about journalists covering the movement, and they talk about how quietly, almost to a man, because they were all men back then, were very sympathetic with the movement that they were covering, and but they still tried to be as objective and honest and honorable as they could be. But it was just it's an incredible story. It was you know, to stand on the streets of Clarksdale and see black children arrested for parading without a permit when they marched around with American flags and thrown in jail. These kids in 4th and 5th, 6th grade. To hear the police chief of Clarksdale, well, he would jam people into the jails. He would arrest them during the demonstrations. You'd have a jail cell that might hold ordinarily 6 people, and he had 40 people in. And then if it was the summer, he'd turn on the heat. Real nice guy. I remember when he liked to be the referee at football games on Friday nights. He liked to dress up in his referee uniform, and he loved his police uniform with all the braids and the epaulets. And when John Kennedy was killed and all the games were canceled that weekend, this was his nice remark. He said, "I hope the next time they shoot one of those sons of bitches, they do it during hockey season." So these are the people that I'm covering, and you know, these are our elected officials or our appointed officials, and it didn't take long for me to choose sides on the thing. Probably more than I should have, because I eventually got involved quietly, and sometimes not so quietly, in trying to help Aaron and some of the people in the movement.
Curtis, back then, a lot of my white friends would have laughed at that joke. What was it that was within you, either in your upbringing or your outlook, that allowed you to recognize that for what it was at that time?
Yeah, I don't know. I fortunately came from a good home environment. My mother was a school teacher and my stepfather was a Presbyterian minister, so I was in a home where education was stressed, and we had books, and we talked about events. And I had worked away from Mississippi each summer that I was in college, and was thrown into situations where it was integrated, and I enjoyed the novelty. I said, you know, what's wrong with this? And then I was here for the events of 1962. I got a great letter from my mother just before the trouble erupted, and she said simply, "Son, your great-grandfather Gilmer left Ole Miss 100 years ago to fight the Federals." He was in the Lamar Rifles unit, period. He did not accomplish a thing, period. See that you don't get involved, period, mother. Best letter I ever got. So I had a good environment, but just being able to see what was going on firsthand, it would leave you very hard not to be moved by by what I saw.
Curtis, we have students here in the audience tonight. One of the attributes that you had at an early age that stood well for you as a reporter was your ability and willingness to challenge authority. How did you come to that at an early age and then continue it?
Well, I did that in school, so it's just natural that I did it as a journalist. I think most journalists are willing to do that. They know that's part of the job, that you don't just take a press release from somebody and either rewrite it or stick it in, put your byline on top of it. That you're supposed to be skeptical and questioning authority, and I don't think there's anything extraordinary about me. I think virtually every journalist I know has those same characteristics, that you don't take anything at face value. You're prepared to ask questions and develop good, tough questions, and take it from there. Sometimes you antagonize people and you make enemies, but that comes with the territory.
Curtis, the other attribute that shows up in your stories early on is what I would call context. I go back and read some of my stories from when I was in my 20s and 30s. They were woefully single-dimensional. He said, she said, like a stenographer reporting. I read your stories when Clarksdale and further on, and they always had context to them. For the students and for all of us, what's the secret to being able to understand and write context?
Yeah, I'm not sure, but there are two words that I try to emphasize. If there's anybody in my journalism 472, we haven't gotten there yet, but we will. And it's context and texture, that I think both of those are very important elements in a story. And one, things don't happen in a vacuum. There's some reason behind it. And it's important, I think, to try to give the reader some idea of what's going on and why, see if that is context. Sometimes it's historical context. And, even my political stories, I would try to come up with some, what happened here 4 years before or 8 years ago, or why this state was pivotal. And I think it's an important ingredient in stories. And then the texture is, it is just trying to weave together a story that's got not just an important news lead that grabs you, but it's got quotes in it. Quotes are wonderful. If you can get great quotes for stories, they make a story. It's better than you sitting there writing. If you got good quotes, they're wonderful. So good quotes, anecdotes, descriptive detail of whether it's mannerism or whether you're setting a scene. Sometimes it's a very good way to start a story, just to set a scene. So there are any number of devices that you can use to take a story beyond your ordinary stories that we write in Journalism 101, or at least I did, the who, what, when, where, how, 35-word lead. And I tell my students in feature and magazine writing to, we're going to unlearn some of the stuff you learned in 101. We're going to learn to do it, to challenge the journalistic conventions, to write it differently, to use your imagination, and try to be conceptual and coming up with a good, fresh way to say something.
Well, these stories surely bear that out. The first president you covered full-time was Jimmy Carter, and you got to know him very well, and he got to know you pretty well. Tell us something about Jimmy Carter that we don't know.
Well, behind that big, wonderful smile was basically not a particularly humorous or, nor was he filled with love as he claimed he and America were.
That was just towards you.
He didn't care for me particularly. There were 3 or 4 people who covered his campaign. Because I was a House Southerner at the Globe, they assigned me to cover Carter. It was also my first year or 2 there, and I didn't have any seniority, so they gave me the worst candidate they thought, this peanut farmer from Georgia, and I started covering him in November of '75. So I essentially traveled everywhere with him for a year up until the election, and we clashed repeatedly. He thought that I was a smart ass, and I think there's some truth to that. Irreverent questions. We had a lot of fun. There was a guy named Steve Brill who wrote a famous story in either Harper's or Atlantic called Jimmy Carter's Pathetic Lies. It came out early in the campaign. And it was about these weird little fibs he would tell. Like he claimed he was a nuclear physicist, and in fact he was a nuclear engineer, which is not quite the same thing. And he would say these things. And so we started collecting all Jimmy Carter's pathetic lies, and we claimed his nose was getting longer and things like that. So there were 3 Southerners on the campaign, and he didn't like any of us because I think we all felt he should be more progressive than he was. That he was not as progressive as he painted himself to be. And I think it was fair criticism on his part that we were holding him to a higher standard. And he was resentful, and that's okay. I'd rather have a politician resent me than like me too much. And it was fun. Oh, Lord, it was fun. I had never known somebody who was going to be president or vice versa. And I enjoyed it. It was an exciting campaign. And as a Southerner, I wanted him to win in my own way, but I would get so angry with him. And Charles, you were on the trip that last weekend when we were on the West Coast, and the word came out that Clinton King, who's a black man who had tried to integrate Ole Miss back in the 50s before Meredith, and he tried to integrate the Plains Baptist Church that Sunday. And rather than let him worship with them, the deacons at the church shut the church down. And Carter was, in fact, Eleanor Randolph, who at that time was with the Chicago Tribune, she and I grabbed him that morning as he was leaving an event because we heard about it. And Eleanor was from Pensacola and the Southerner that he didn't care for either. Jim Wooten was the New York Times from Tennessee, was the third bad guy from the South. And we said, Governor, what do you know about what's going on at the Plains Baptist Church? And he claimed he didn't know anything and had nothing to do with it. And I began checking out, and I called some people back in Georgia, and he had known since Thursday that Clinton King was going to do there, and he didn't do a damn thing. And he let the church, let them shut the doors to Clinton King, and that was as mad as I ever got with Carter that day. I was really angry with him, and we had a clash on the plane, and a clash later that night at dinner where I said some things that weren't fair, and Carter had a press conference the next morning to try to recover from it, and he did let me ask the first question at the press conference, and then he went home and won it the next day, and I was glad he won. But we did have our ups and downs, no question. And we did for the 4 years he was in the White House. I covered the White House, and
you occasionally see him now, and you have a pretty good
I
relationship?
have a good relationship with him. I admire what he's done post-presidency. And whenever I see him and he's got a book that I've got, he will sign the book, and it's always to my old friend Curtis. So you know, it's nice. I was delighted when he won the Nobel Prize, because what he's done for peace and things he's done in Africa and things he's done to try to promote peace and resolve conflict is better than any other former president.
Tell them about sitting in his Sunday school class that he was teaching.
Yeah, the summer of '76, we were there. I lived there. I lived in the Best Western Hotel in Americus, Georgia, room 220. Still remember my address.
Probably a plaque up there now.
And I never went to Sunday school. All the other reporters, and we didn't have a big press corps back then. We had no more than about 15 or 20 of us that were hardcore, traveling everywhere with him. And I wouldn't go to Sunday school or church. And I would go to Billy Carter's, his brother's service station, and drink beer with Billy because you couldn't sell beer in Georgia on Sunday, so Billy gave it away. And Miss Lillian, Jimmy's mother, who was quite a character too, the whole family, a bunch of characters, she would give me a lot of crap about how I didn't go to Sunday school. So finally I went to Sunday school one Sunday, and he was teaching the class, and he looked around and said, "Everybody got a Bible here?" And I raised my hand. He said, "Well, Curtis, of course you wouldn't." And he loaned me his Bible, and it was really quite touching. I began looking at the Bible. It was dog-eared. It was annotated, underlined. This is a man who really took his faith seriously. So for all of the mockery he got about being self-righteous, this is a guy who was deeply religious, and that was impressive.
You have a story in here that talks about Jimmy Carter ultimately not liking Harding Carter, even though Harding Carter was in his State Department. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, Harding was, the editor of the Greenville paper, and he left in '76 and worked for the Carter campaign. And then Carter made him spokesman for the State Department. Harding's an old pal of mine, and after the abortive rescue mission in Iran early in '80. Harding's boss, the Secretary of State, Cy Vance, resigned in protest. He did it very quietly and diplomatically because he had disagreed with the mission. And so Harding left too. But unlike Cy Vance, Harding was willing to unload on some people. And I learned, I was out at the Republican convention in Detroit, and I got word that Harding was ready to fire off, and he would talk to me on the record. And so I left the convention, flew all the way to Owl's Nest, Maine, where Harding had a place, and spent the better part of the day talking to him, and he just let everybody have it, from Jimmy Carter to particularly Zbigniew Brzezinski, the National Security Advisor, who I didn't care for either, so I enjoyed writing as he trashed Brzezinski. And he unloaded on all sorts of people. And it was a great story, and it led to the Globe the next day and got picked up nationally. And fast forward to would have been December of that year. Carter has been beaten. He's gone home for the last time as president, and maybe 10 or 12 of us, the hardcore, flew back with him to cover that last weekend in Plains before he gave up the office. And he offered to invite us all over for drinks at his house. He's not a big drinker, but he would occasionally have a very heavily watered down scotch. Brother Billy took up the slack for the family, but we said we'd rather take you and Rosalind, his wife, to dinner. And there was a fairly nice little French restaurant of all things on the road between Americus and Plains. And there were about 3 or 4 tables, maybe seated 8 each, and we were all milling around there. And there were even camera crews were there. Everybody was there. And Carter came in, and we had no seating arrangement. He just happened to sit at the table where I was sitting with Sam Donaldson, I remember, who was probably the funniest and one of the best reporters on the White House, in the White House press corps. And it was supposed to be off the record, and it was for about 2.5 years. And Carter was extraordinary. He unloaded on people that he said things he would never have said in public. And at one point I says, well, Mr. President, did you read Harding Carter's story in Playboy? I think Harding had written his own version of what he had told me, trashing all these various people. And Carter looked at me with this penetrating glare. He had the meanest look. He had very blue eyes, his most piercing glare he could give you, just withering. And he fixed it on me. He said, and he knew Harding was a good friend of mine. He said, I read it and it really pissed me off. He said, I think Harding is a creep. And he said, I went through it and I marked up about 25 things he had wrong, and then I threw it in the garbage can. So there's your candidate filled with love and all of that. So Harding loved the story when it finally came out. I finally kind of broke the embargo because all these stories began trickling out anyway, and it was annoying to have all these wonderful stories that were getting out piecemeal. And his memoirs finally came out, and they had all this stuff that was contrary to what he had told us. And I said, hell, as far as I'm concerned, Carter has broken the embargo, and I'm going to report everything that he said, because we had all got together after the dinner and compared notes to make sure we knew everything he said. It was an extraordinary conversation. So I wrote the story, and he blew his stack over that and didn't speak to me for about a year afterwards. He would come to Washington and I'd be invited to things. He'd just give me the cold shoulder. But we warmed up again after a while.
I'm going to go to the audience with questions here in just a second, but I wanted to ask you about Bill Clinton.
I'm sorry?
I wanted to ask you about Bill Clinton. You have some good stories in the book about Clinton. Anything you tell us about Bill Clinton that we don't know?
Probably not.
You covered
he's told you he hurt himself.
You covered the story, and it's in here, about how he and Hillary navigated those political waters when it was coming out about Jennifer Flowers, and they figured out the right response, and it worked. Talk about that.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite stories. It's a long magazine piece I did for the Globe Sunday magazine, and it was based on the campaign in New Hampshire in '92, when so many things happened to him that would have derailed any other candidate. Gary Hart got derailed up there for one little picadillo, and you had, everything imaginable, from what Betsy Wright called bimbo eruptions, one on one hand. The next week there'd be new ones, and Jennifer Flowers, sold her story to one of the tabloids, and then somebody leaked his letter about dodging the draft and how you saved me from the draft. And it was just an extraordinary, I call it the great escape, how he escaped New Hampshire. And he escaped because he's so damn resilient. He is, I've often said he's by far the smartest guy I've ever known. He is so damn smart and charming. He'll talk about anything. You carry on the conversation. Most politicians want to talk about their agenda and their issues. He'll talk about anything, and he'll talk your ear off. And you learn if you cover him enough that like most politicians, there's deceit there, and he's not perfect. But that month there, where his campaign was on the line, was one of the more extraordinary stories that I was there firsthand and saw it. But then there was so much going on that I didn't know at the time that I reconstructed it, and the magazine story came out the Sunday before he went to New York to get the nomination, and I just went through how they had dealt with all these various issues. And I learned that, for example, as he was preparing to run for president, and that was the reason he didn't run in '88. He had originally prepared to run in '88, and he was afraid that the stories of his various dalliances with women would come out, and Chelsea was at a particularly tender age, and he backed away from that. But I learned that he went to Chicago and met with big money people, and they were grilling him pretty hard. Clinton had a real reputation for this. Everybody knew it. And he was talking to one guy who told me the story. He says, shouldn't there be a statute of limitations on adultery? Yes, I got things like that, and then how you dealt with it. And Hillary, was with him, and so I dealt with them and talked with them, and but I talked with all the people on the staff, and they were very good at giving me a lot of inside baseball. And that story is the first and only story I think I ever wrote for a newspaper in third-person narrative, like a novel. It was, I think, about a 7,000-word story it broke a lot of new ground in it, and it was just so many interesting things about traveling with Clinton, because he was just, he was so smart, and he was fun. He was fun to cover, a lot more fun than Carter.
So it's safe to say you liked Clinton better than Carter?
Oh, yeah. Clinton, even his enemies kind of like him. Today, if he could run today, he'd get elected, I think.
Let's go to the audience for questions. Don't be shy here.
We can all go home.
I've got other questions. Yes, back, Deb.
Interesting that you say if he ran today, he'd be elected. Any thoughts about Hillary running and her chances?
I think she's going to be very formidable, and I think she probably is going to run. I said last time, my dear friend Ann Abity, actually I should cite Ann. It was Ann's idea that the University Press do this book. Ann is a huge Hillary fan, and I told her 4 years ago, and I'm not usually prescient, I'm usually wrong about things, but I said, I don't think Hillary's going to make it. And I tease her now and say, Hillary's not even going to get the nomination. Somebody's going to come along, and in 2008, it was Obama that came along. And I think somebody could come out of the woodwork, but, certainly, if I had to bet, I would say she probably would get the nomination. Whether she'll be elected, I don't know. It depends on whether the dingbats in the Republican Party nominate a dingbat. If so, we may have the first woman president. I like Hillary. She doesn't like me anymore because I wrote Jim McDougall's book for him, and my bylines associated with the title. I wrote the whole thing, and Jim went to prison for them because of the Whitewater scandal, but Jim hated Hillary. He was ambivalent about Bill, but hated Hillary. So all that comes out in the book under my name. So, I think, I don't expect to be named her next press secretary or anything. But I admire her, and I liked her a lot in the campaign.
Other questions? Yes. How did Carter feel about Reagan?
How did Carter feel about Reagan? Carter vastly underestimated Reagan. I think a lot of us in the press corps underestimated Reagan. He thought he could handle Reagan easily in '80. In fact, I think they were pleased that he got the nomination, because they thought somebody else might be stronger. And I think Carter, for all I'm saying, Carter's a very smart guy too, very intelligent. It's kind of a cold intelligence. And Carter thought he's smarter than anybody anyway, but he thought he was much smarter than Reagan, and therefore he'd be easy to beat. And he didn't realize how well, and I didn't cover the Reagan campaign, and so I didn't realize how good Reagan was at really resonating with the people out there. So, but they were shocked when they lost. They thought up until the last day of the campaign they were going to win. And I'll never forget, we were in Seattle, the last stop on the campaign. It was Monday night, and midnight in Seattle. And they got the word from their pollster. Everybody thought it was neck and neck, and Carter was slightly ahead. And they got the word from their pollster that it had collapsed over the weekend, and that they were going to lose all but about 6 or 7 states. And that's exactly what happened. And happily, one of the Carter staff guys told me about it on the way back to Georgia. He says, "You can't write about it." I said, "Well, I don't have no place to write about it now anyway, because next story I write will be election night." He said, "Well, we're going to get clobbered." And they were in shock. And I think they really, in part, they lost one because Reagan's a much better candidate, but they lost because they underestimated him.
Other questions? Yes, David.
Curtis, who, present company accepted, who were the best, most inquisitive journalists you worked with through your career?
Oh, Lord, David, there's so many good journalists out there. And there were good journalists that people didn't know about from small papers. Those are the people that I think are kind of the, people that they're kind of the heroes that are writing for papers and nobody's really reading what they're writing. And so there are a lot of good people out there. I'd say virtually everybody I worked with was pretty damn good. There were a few that were bad, and usually they would be the people who were homers for one candidate or another. I remember when I covered Nixon a little bit in '72, they had one guy from the Columbus Dispatch who would
I know him.
salute Nixon when he would take off in the helicopter. You remember that guy?
I do remember. I'm trying to remember his name.
He was disgusting. And there was a guy from the Cox newspapers that came to Plains. He was from New York, and he came to Plains and he put on coveralls and walked around town with a piece of straw in his mouth. You know, and those kind of people were real jerks. So, you know, there were jerks, but by and large, you know, the people that I travel with and, you know, work beside, they're all good. I wouldn't want to begin to single people out because I'd forget people. Not trying to dodge the question, it's just,
Who were the biggest characters among
Sam Donaldson with ABC was a great character, and Sam was very good. I mean, he really knew what he was doing, but he was always making people laugh. Characters, Johnny Apple from New York Times, for all his pomposity and putting on airs, was an absolutely splendid reporter. I'm probably forgetting people. You know, we all had a lot of fun. We played practical jokes. Jim Norton, New York Times, great practical joker. I wasn't on this trip. It was a Gerald Ford trip to College Station, and Tom DeFrank from Newsweek had gone to Texas A&M. So Norton led this joke, and it involved several co-conspirators. And they arranged for Tom DeFrank to go out to dinner somewhere and to keep him out for an hour or so. And they smuggled a sheep into his bedroom at the hotel. And then they hid in the bathroom. And so DeFrank comes walking in, opens the door, and there's this sheep on the bed. And he's shocked, and then they come banging out of the bathroom yelling. Of course, the sheep gets excited, and you know what happens next on the bed. Tom DeFrank got even after the election. They were covering Gerald Ford's White House. He cut a deal with Jim Baker, who was Ford's chief of staff, that Ford was at the White House and they would call Jim and say, we have arranged an exclusive interview at Camp David at 8 a.m. on Saturday morning or something. And Jim dutifully drove up to Thurmont, Maryland. It's about an hour and a half from Washington. Gets to the gate of Camp David, and the guard says, you know, I don't know what you're talking about, you know. And he gets on the phone and he calls. If it wasn't Baker, it was, help me, the other guy who was chief of staff. Anyway, he calls off and says, what's going on here? And the chief of staff, if it wasn't Baker, it was the other guy, hands the phone to Tom DeFrank, who's in the office, says, hi, Jim. So he got even. So there were things like that that went on. And so, we were serious about our jobs, but we didn't take ourselves terribly seriously, and we managed to have a lot of fun. We'd have food fights on the planes and those sorts of things.
Yes.
Thank you for your time tonight. It's clear that you spent a good deal of time with some of the big figures in American history, the last century, that have made a positive difference, whether it be Dr. King or President Carter or President Clinton. Is there any common factor from them that you can point to, either in their character or how they dealt with or treated people?
Good question.
Yeah, I think sure there'd be several things just right off the top, that they would all be intelligent people. They'd be driven. They would have energy that ordinary people wouldn't have. You think of a Reagan, who at my age today, it's unimaginable. I can't imagine getting out and going through a campaign like he did when he's my age today. I mean, no way in hell I would do that. They've got to have a drive. You know, it takes an extraordinary personality to tackle these things and to succeed in them. Pick you had.
Oh, I'm just, kind of a practical question, Curtis. You did a lot of your writing before we had computers or ways to store
Oh, sure, yeah.
stories. Just wondering how you were able to, get all your stories and compile them for your book, Resurrect, I guess you could say.
I kind of came from the dinosaur era of journalism before all the stuff that's available today. A lot of my stories, I happen to have, like the ones from Clarksdale, just old yellow papers. My mother saved my stories, and so I had some of them. I was able electronically the Globe has, digitized all the stuff, and I was able to get the Globe stories online and get their permission to use them. It's interesting that in the old days, our biggest problem as journalists who would travel would be to file the story. Not to write the story or to get the story, but how are you going to get it to the home office? You had to rely upon telephones. You didn't have cell phones. And sometimes if you were traveling a campaign, they'd have filing time for 15 minutes, and there might be 30 of us on a plane, and there'd be 10 phones. It'd be a scrum to figure out who gets the phones, and people are pounding on each other. Hurry up! I've got a file. This sort of thing. Overseas, it was even more difficult. In places like Beirut, where everything's shot all to hell, you would you file your stories at telex from the hotel. And sometimes that didn't work. So it was a real frustration. Even when I moved to Jerusalem in the mid '80s, and we did have computers, but they were still fairly primitive generations, and sometimes you'd have trouble making them work. So today, everybody's got it easy, I think. I mean, you got cell phones, and you can link in so easily. We didn't have that, and for the first probably nearly 20 years of my career, everything I wrote was on typewriter, on paper.
One last question? Well, we got several questions. Let's try to take a couple here.
I'm not sure I'm gonna recognize a guy in a Yankee shirt, Chico.
Curtis, did you ever interview Pete Seeger or Bob Dylan, anyone of that nature that was involved in political demonstrations? And how much influence do you think they had on what they were trying to do?
Oh, I think they have influence, sometimes probably to reinforce people. I never interviewed, say, Pete Seeger or Bob Dylan. I'd see them at rallies. Some of them I was marching in back in the late 60s and 70s when I wasn't a journalist and was working on Capitol Hill as congressional fellow. Trying to think of showbiz people. My favorite person was Deb, ever tell you, Deborah Winger. She traveled with Dukakis, and I had just gotten back from living in Israel, and she had moved there as a young 21-year-old, and they had immediately put her in the Army, and she didn't like that, so she moved back to Cleveland. And I got to know her pretty well, and she was very funny and very, she's done a lot of work here around Oxford, and she loves to come to Oxford. So, there are various celebrities, Shirley MacLaine and Warren Beatty both travel with McGovern. these people kind of latch on that. There was a guy traveled with Gore, and I always get his name mixed up. John Bon Jovi, is that right? So, but Stephen Stills traveled with somebody. I had a great conversation with Stills one time. John Denver got on the plane with Carter, and he got angry because Carter didn't recognize him with as much flattery as he expected, and he got off the plane, went his own way. But some of these people were kind of fun.
There's a question in the back, and then we'll end with Dr. Norton. Yes?
I wanted to know, specifically like when you were a senior here at the university, does anything stand out in particular? And what was your salary in Clarksville? First job.
Did you hear that? What
Yeah,
stood
he's
out?
going to tell me. I've got a hearing aid on, but I didn't pick it all
What
up.
stood out from when you were a senior here, and then what was your salary in Clarksdale?
Oh, I can tell you right away, my salary in Clarksdale, take home was $63 a week. I'll never forget that. That was more than I made at the quilt factory at Summit, though, which I made $72 every 2 weeks. Summit, and
What stands out to you now from your senior year here at Ole Miss?
Oh, obviously, all the trouble with Meredith, the crisis, and I didn't like the politicians anyway, but I became totally disillusioned with the Mississippi politicians and the Ole Miss administration. It totally caved in and turned the school over to Governor Barnett and his henchmen, and we're still paying for it today, for turning the university over to politicians.
And the last word and question from Dr. Norton.
Curtis, I first heard about you in the early 70s, Boys on the Bus. Tell us about Timothy Krause.
First, to put in context, if you hadn't heard, there was a book written, best-selling book, during the 1972 presidential campaign called Boys on the Bus. And that's when Curtis became a national celebrity because Curtis's work and antics were chronicled in that book.
Tim was far too kind to me in the book, and he was far too harsh on some really good reporters. It was an irreverent portrait of the press corps in the presidential campaign. It's a very funny book. I mean, I liked the book, and I was, needless to say, enormously flattered to have been in it. I was working for the Wilmington News Journal that campaign, and it was because of that book that the Boston Globe hired me, I'm sure. I think the book may still be used in some journalism schools because it's a dated book. The political press corps, it's not like we were in '72. It was titled The Boys on the Bus, and there were virtually no women covering the campaign. Today you go out and more than half the reporters will be women today. But I think Tim, in terms of my involvement, Tim, he and I were kind of same kind of characters. He was a young guy. We both had long hair and irreverent, and he liked what I wrote. I wrote in kind of an impressionistic style, and bless his heart, he said I did not follow the pack. And one of the critiques in the book was of a term he used called pack journalism, that so many people, they all kind of banded together and wrote the same stories. The book's a hell of a lot of fun. It is a very funny book. He gets all these, stories like how it was written before DeFrank and the Sheep, but there are lots of racy stories about misbehavior among the press corps and the relationship with the candidates. And he was dead on with a lot of it. I mean, there's one great scene in it. My friend Tom Oliphant figures in that was the day that the McGovern economic advisor got on the bus to give us an economic briefing. We were traveling in a rainstorm from Manhattan up to someplace in Connecticut. And this guy named Gordon Weil gets on the bus and is going to give us an economic briefing. Nobody wanted to hear an economic briefing. You know, people were drinking beer and playing cards and, get the hell off the bus. And he persisted. We had apples in a box lunch. So we began throwing apples at him. And Tom was the leader of the pack attacking poor old Gordon Weil. And we finally made the bus driver stop and literally evicted him from the bus. He had to get on another bus. It was a caravan, about 4 or 5 buses. So that was in the Krause book, things like that. And it's a funny book. It's an important book. It's a good book. I'm not sure how accurate it is. I haven't covered anything since 2000. I'm sure that I'd be a total fish out of water today. But if you're looking for a laugh, Square Book's still got it. What is fun, I'll say on a personal note, the original book and all the other ones had a picture of me and I'm sitting at a table on a train in the McGovern campaign, and I got a can of Coors in front of me, and my mother saw the picture. She said, "Oh, son, that's so wonderful. I was glad to see you were drinking Coke." She saw the CO. Well, anyway, the photographer who took that picture was Annie Leibovitz. And when the book was reissued a few years ago, all the pictures of Annie's that had been used in the original book no longer available. I guess they couldn't afford to buy them. So my picture has vanished from the edition that's still on sale, but that was kind of a kick. Annie was a freelance photographer for Rolling Stone. Tim Krause, who wrote it, was a staff writer for Rolling Stone. So it was a product of Rolling Stone.
It's not unusual for reporters after a long, illustrious career to be able to talk about people they have known. But from this conversation tonight, from this book here that's out at Square Books, it's clear that these people know Curtis. People from all over the country, nationally known, come to Oxford. Large reason is to be able to see Curtis and Nancy. A lot of them stay with them. And Curtis and Nancy could live anywhere, but they choose to live in Oxford, and we're better for it. Thank you, Curtis.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you.